In the dim light of dusk, a pair of amber eyes watched the silhouette of a man walking away. Those eyes were filled with anticipation, trust, and then shattered into despair. Connor, a German Shepherd once hailed as the pride of the K-9 unit, now stood motionless inside a cold iron cage. No more medals, no more applause, no more encouraging pats on the head. Only darkness and betrayal remained. Will you come back for me? Did I do something wrong? If Connor could speak, that's what he would ask. But he couldn't. He could only watch as Jake Wilkins, the man who had once meant everything to him, walked away without looking back. "Sorry, kid," Jake mumbled, hastily stuffing a wad of cash into his jacket pocket. "You're just a dog." The iron doors swung shut, the sound echoing like a sentence passed. Connor didn't understand. He had been through life and death with Jake. He had once thrown himself in front of a bullet for him. He had trusted him more than he trusted himself. And yet now, Jake had sold him out just to cover up a human crime. A human who had once called him family. Connor lay down, ears drooping in disappointment. His heart still raced at the sound of Jake's footsteps, but now, he knew. Jake would never come back. The cramped, foul-smelling room reeked of disinfectant and rusted metal, the stench hitting Connor's nose with brutal force. The other dogs in the adjacent cages whimpered weakly, some too exhausted to resist any longer. Connor could still feel the dull ache in his back where the cold needles had pierced his skin just hours ago. He didn't know what they had injected into him, but waves of heat and cold pulsed along his spine, making him want to collapse. "You're still holding up well. I need another sample from you." A deep, hoarse voice echoed through the room. A man in a long coat, a half-burned cigar resting between his fingers, crouched down to peer at Connor through the bars. His eyes were cold, void of emotion, like a scientist observing his test subject. "You know, I've heard about you before. The legendary K-9 dog." He let out a derisive chuckle. "And yet, here you are, just another useless beast." Connor let out a weak growl, but the man paid him no mind. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Connor alone with a bitter truth. He had once been a hero, but now he was nothing more than a number on an experiment list. Had Connor accepted his fate? No. He could still feel his heartbeat. It hadn't stopped. That meant he was still alive. And as long as he was alive, there was still hope. Suddenly, the blaring wail of an alarm shattered the silence. A distant explosion rocked the entire facility. The acrid scent of smoke filled the air, flames licking at the metal shelves, turning the space into a fiery inferno. Screams erupted. Silhouettes of panicked lab workers darted toward the exits. Connor had a chance. He gathered the last of his strength and rammed against the cage door. Once, twice, 3 times. Collision, bang, collision. The door burst open. Connor collapsed onto the floor, his legs trembling, but he couldn't stop. He had to run. He had to get out of here. He bolted through the thick smoke, dodging shattered glass and leaping over the spreading flames. The other dogs remained trapped in their cages, some staring at him with desperate, pleading eyes. Connor skidded to a halt. He couldn't leave them behind. He bit down on the nearest cage handle, yanking it with all his might. Once, twice, 3 times. Click! The door swung open. Weak and frightened, the dogs stumbled out, eyes wide with terror. "Run! Get out of here!" If Connor could speak, he would have shouted those very words. He took the lead, and the others followed. The lab's main door was wide open. If they could just make it past it, they would be free. Hourglass not done, one more step. Connor could almost taste the freedom beyond that door. But just as he lunged toward it, a figure emerged in his path. It was him, Victor Langley, the man with the cigar. He didn't look panicked. On the contrary, he was smiling. "You really thought you could escape?" Connor growled and took a cautious step back. He knew this was dangerous. "No worries. We'll be seeing each other again soon." Before Connor could react, a deafening explosion rang out above. A chunk of the ceiling collapsed, forming a wall of fire between him and Victor. There was no time to think. Connor turned and bolted straight for the exit. Thick smoke clouded the sky. The dogs scattered into the darkness. Connor had no idea where he was heading, but he knew he had to keep running. He ran and ran until the distant city lights faded into nothingness. His legs finally gave out beneath an old, rusted iron gate. His breath came in ragged gasps. Before him, a weathered sign swayed quietly in the wind. Hillgrove Cemetery. Connor didn't know that this place would soon offer him a new glimmer of hope. But at that moment, he simply closed his eyes and drifted into the deepest sleep he had had in what felt like an eternity. His first rest after endless days of pain and despair. The icy drizzle fell upon Hillgrove Cemetery, shrouding the old gravestones in a veil of mist. The silence was so profound that the winds howling through the skeletal trees could be clearly heard. Connor lay curled up beneath the eaves of the old chapel, his fur damp and matted with mud. He had escaped, but now he was just a stray dog without a home. Where will I go now? He didn't know. He only knew that his legs had carried him to this place. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed along the gravel path. An old man, clad in a worn-out woolen sweater, held a lantern in his hand as he approached. "Oh, you poor thing," he murmured softly, his kind eyes taking in the sight of Connor huddled beneath the eaves. This was Arthur Gibbons, the cemetery caretaker for over 20 years. He slowly knelt, extending his wrinkled hand towards Connor. The dog flinched slightly, his eyes filled with caution. He no longer dared to trust anyone. "You must have been through something terrible," Arthur continued, his voice as gentle as if he were speaking to an abandoned child. The rain continued to fall. Connor gazed deeply into the old man's eyes. No deceit, no betrayal, only warmth and sincerity. Slowly, he lowered his tucked ears and took a cautious step forward, his cold nose barely brushing against the wrinkled hand. Arthur smiled. "Well, that's better. Come inside now. I have some food and a warm place for you." Connor hesitated for a moment, then followed the old man into the small house behind the cemetery. Fire a strange night. Signs of the unusual fire. After a warm meal and being dried off, Connor curled up on an old rug near the fireplace. It had been a long time since he had felt such peace, but just a few hours later, something made him jolt upright. A sound, a faint noise echoed through the night, like earth being disturbed. Connor's brow furrowed, his ears perked up, and his breathing grew rapid. He could smell something wrong. Unable to ignore it, Connor dashed outside, leaving Arthur sound asleep in his room. He sprinted past rows of graves, his paws skimming over the wet ground. Instinct told him something was very wrong. Then he stopped. Before him lay a freshly dug grave, just a few meters from the chapel. The headstone bore a name, Michael Calloway. A low growl rumbled in Connor's throat, the fur along his back bristling. He didn't understand why, but something deep inside him was screaming. Without thinking, he began to dig frantically. His paws tore into the damp earth, relentless. He couldn't explain why he was doing this. He only knew that something beneath needed saving. He barked, sharp and urgent, his voice echoing through the empty cemetery. Hourglass not done, Arthur wakes. Doubt begins, hourglass not done. Arthur was startled awake by Connor's fierce barking. He sat up abruptly, threw on his raincoat, and rushed outside. "Connor, what are you doing?" Arthur called out, but the dog continued to claw at the dirt with unwavering determination. As Arthur approached, he stopped dead in his tracks. This grave, he was certain that no one had been buried here last week. So, why was there a new headstone? Arthur knelt down, pressing his hand against the ground. The soil was still soft, as if it had been freshly disturbed. A chill ran down his spine. "What is happening?" Connor looked up at him, his eyes pleading. He didn't know how to tell the old man that he could feel life beneath. "Someone is down there." Arthur clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He looked at Connor, then at the grave. Arthur knelt beside the grave, his trembling hand resting on the soft earth. His heart pounded in his chest as a growing sense of unease took hold of him. "Connor, are you sure?" Connor didn't respond. He only growled, digging more frantically, sending clumps of dirt flying into the air. Arthur swallowed hard. He had been the caretaker of the cemetery for over 20 years, but never before had he dug up a grave that wasn't on record. But what if someone was still alive down there? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, he ran to find a shovel. Connor continued barking furiously, urging him to hurry. Hourglass not on the cry for help from beneath the earth. The rain kept falling, but Arthur no longer felt the cold. Each thrust of the shovel drove deep into the earth, lifting heavy, damp soil. Everything was eerily silent. Only the sound of his ragged breathing and Connor's frantic scratching filled the night. And then, something soft met the tip of his shovel. Arthur froze. It wasn't soil. It wasn't rock. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what it was, a white-painted wooden coffin stained with mud. "Oh, Lord!" Arthur hastily threw the shovel aside and dropped to his knees, brushing away the remaining dirt covering the coffin lid. Connor growled warily. He could smell a human, but not the scent of the dead. He sensed a faint heartbeat. Arthur leaned in closer, placing his hand on the coffin. He held his breath. Then a small sound came from inside. Collision knock. 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 Collision. Arthur jolted in shock. A hoarse voice called out from below, so weak it was almost drowned out by the rain. "Help me!" In that moment, Arthur felt as if all the blood in his body had turned to ice. Someone was alive in there. Fire life on the edge. Arthur frantically used all his strength to pry open the coffin lid. His aged hands trembled uncontrollably, but he didn't stop. Collision thud. Collision. The lid snapped open. Inside, a young man lay motionless, his face pale, his breathing shallow. His wrists were tightly bound, his mouth sealed with duct tape, his eyes wide with terror. Connor immediately leaped up, gently licking the young man's face, as if trying to reassure him. He could feel life, but it was slipping away. Arthur, panicked, tore off the tape covering the young man's mouth, his trembling hands gripping the boy's shoulders. "Hey, can you hear me?" The young man let out a weak groan, his eyelids fluttering, his breath uneven. The old man turned to Connor, his voice urgent. "Connor, we need help right now." Connor barked loudly, as if he understood the urgency of the situation. Hourglass not done, the rescue team arrives. A shocking revelation. Arthur shakily pulled out his old phone, his wet hands struggling to press the buttons on the screen. But he had no other choice. He called the police immediately. Telephone receiver, hello. Someone has been buried alive at Hillgrove Cemetery. I need an ambulance. Right now. 10 minutes later, police lights illuminated the cemetery. Sarah Carter, a young police officer, jumped out of the car with her gun drawn. She couldn't believe her eyes. A young man, bound and unconscious, lying beneath an unregistered grave? What the hell was going on? She stepped forward, checking the young man's pulse. It was weak, but still there. He's alive. Call an ambulance now. Fire the victim's identity and unanswered questions. As the ambulance drove away, Sarah turned to Arthur. Who buried him here? Arthur shook his head, his face still pale with shock. I don't know, but one thing is certain. He looked at Connor, the dog still standing alert beside the grave, his sharp eyes watching the darkness beyond. If it weren't for Connor, he would have died. Sarah turned to the gravestone, a sinking feeling in her chest. The name engraved on it, Michael Calloway. Sarah's breath hitched. She had heard that name before. Just days ago, Michael Calloway, the mayor's son, had been reported missing. She turned to Arthur, her voice filled with urgency. We need to talk. Right now. Connor looked up at the sky, where the rain continued to fall. He could sense it. This was only the beginning. A dark secret was unraveling, and he had just pulled back the curtain. English translation. The sound of an ambulance siren echoed through the night, red and blue lights flashing amidst the damp cemetery. Sarah stood by the grave, her hand still unconsciously gripping the gun. She stared at the name on the tombstone. Michael Calloway, the mayor's son, reported missing 3 days ago, had just been found, buried alive beneath the damp earth. This can't be a coincidence, Sarah thought, her eyes shifting toward Connor. The German shepherd standing still, eyes alert, fixed on the darkness beyond the cemetery. She turned to Arthur, her voice still tinged with shock. "Are you sure? No one has registered a burial here in the past few days?" Arthur took a deep breath, glancing at the old notebook he always carried with him. The handwritten entries were neat and meticulous, just like the man himself. Flipping through the pages, he stopped, furrowing his brows. "No, I've checked all the records. 3 days ago, this grave was still empty." His words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Hourglass not done, the victim's testimony. The nightmare isn't over. At the hospital, Michael Calloway woke up from his coma, his throat burning dry as if scorched. The moment his eyes met Sarah's, panic immediately flared in his pupils. "They're still out there?" Michael's voice was hoarse, weak, yet filled with desperation. Sarah sat beside the bed, trying to reassure him. "You need to tell me what happened. Who did this to you?" Michael clenched the hospital blanket, his hands trembling. Then, broken words escaped his lips. "I found something I wasn't supposed to know. They wanted me gone, but not in the usual way. They wanted me dead, silently." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "They?" Michael looked up at her, terror flooding his gaze. "The Invisibles. Fire, the hidden enemy's planned fire." Sarah froze. She had heard that name before. A high-tech criminal organization operating in the shadows, hacking into global financial systems, executing transactions so elusive that no one could trace them. They were ghosts in the digital world, and now they had set foot in this city. Sarah leaned in, her voice dropping. "What did you find that made them want you dead?" Michael swallowed dryly. "My father's banking system, it's been breached. A hidden program is being installed into the central network. If it goes live, the entire city's digital currency, no, maybe even the world's, will fall under their control." Sarah stared at him. "So you're the only one who knows about this?" Michael nodded weakly. "I was going to warn my father, but before I could, I was kidnapped." He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "They didn't want to kill me right away. They wanted me to be part of their plan, but I refused to cooperate. So, they decided to bury me alive. Hourglass not done, the graveyard mystery. Who gave the order?" Sarah shuddered. A high-tech criminal group had no reason to bury someone alive like this. This kind of killing felt personal. "We're missing something." The next morning, she returned to the cemetery, where Arthur was carefully reviewing his records. Connor was still there. He hadn't left the empty grave, his eyes fixed on the distant trees, as if sensing an unseen threat lurking. Sarah stepped closer to the tombstone, examining it more carefully than she had the night before. And then she noticed something strange. The markings on the tombstone weren't just ordinary engravings. Sarah pulled a charcoal pencil from her pocket and carefully rubbed it over the stone surface. Hidden letters began to emerge. A name she did not want to see. Jake Wilkins. Sarah stiffened. Jake Wilkins, a former police officer, the man who had once trained Connor. The man who had betrayed Connor. No way, was he the one who helped bury Michael alive? Fire, unanswered questions, fire. Sarah clenched her fist. If Jake Wilkins was involved, it meant he had become part of the Invisibles. The only question now was, who was he working for? Why did he choose this cemetery to bury Michael? What was buried here that made the Invisibles take action? Connor growled, his eyes still locked on the distant forest. Sarah followed his gaze, and a chill ran down her spine. Because there, in the misty dawn, she swore she saw a figure clad in black standing among the trees, watching them. And then, like a phantom, he vanished. "We're running out of time." The sky darkened faster than usual. Hillgrove Cemetery was engulfed in a gloomy gray, with only a few dim lights flickering from the old street lamps. Sarah leaned against the patrol car, her eyes fixed on the distant forest where she had seen the shadow disappear that morning. A part of her wanted to believe it was just an illusion, but her instincts as a cop told her they were being watched. Connor sat beside her, his thick fur shifting slightly in the night breeze. He didn't bark or move much, but his ears remained perked, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He knew the danger was still here, lurking in the darkness, waiting. Hourglass not done, Arthur in the old notebook. Inside the small chapel of the cemetery, Arthur sat on an old wooden chair, an aged notebook spread open before him, its pages yellowed with time. He flipped through the pages, mumbling to himself, "No way, that grave isn't in my records. So who put it there?" Arthur recalled his last inspection 3 days ago. At that time, the area was completely empty, but overnight, a grave had appeared, without any ceremony. A grave created just to hide someone who is still alive. The thought sent a chill down his spine, but there was something even more terrifying. Why, on the very night Michael was buried alive, had someone called him away from the cemetery for an entire night? Someone had deliberately removed him from this place at that exact moment. Fut connaître sans danger fut. Arthur hadn't yet pieced everything together when Connor suddenly sprang up. He let out a low growl, eyes locked onto the slightly ajar window. Arthur followed his gaze, his heart tightening. Outside, in the darkness, something was moving among the rows of graves. "Connor, do you see something?" Arthur asked in a hushed, anxious tone. But Connor didn't need to answer, because at that moment, Sarah burst through the door, her voice tense. "Arthur, we have a big problem. Hourglass not done the shadow in the cemetery." Sarah pulled him toward the door, pointing toward the nearby forest. In the flickering glow of the streetlights, they could see a figure in a long coat standing motionless beside an old tombstone. He stood still, as if watching them from a distance. Connor barked loudly, the fur along his back bristling. Arthur swallowed hard. "Who could that be?" Arthur whispered. Sarah didn't take her eyes off the shadow, her hands slowly moving toward the gun at her waist. "I have a suspicion, but I don't like it." The shadow suddenly turned and walked leisurely toward the forest, as if aware they were watching. "No way," Sarah murmured. She knew that someone involved in the case wouldn't return to this place unless they had another purpose. Fire? Was this a trap? Fire. Without a second thought, Sarah drew her gun, signaling Arthur to stay inside the chapel. Connor had already bolted forward, not hesitating for even a second. Sarah followed him, both of them moving swiftly toward the shadowy figure. But as they got closer, there was no one there, only an old, battered phone lying atop the tombstone, its screen glowing with a simple message. "Mobile phone, we are watching. Don't be reckless." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. She spun around. Collision, bam! Collision. A loud noise erupted from the direction of the chapel. Connor growled, sensing that something had just gone terribly wrong. Sarah sprinted back toward the chapel, her heart tightening at the thought of the worst possible scenario. Fire. Arthur had vanished. Fire. When Sarah pushed open the door, the room was empty. The chair Arthur had been sitting in was still spinning slightly, as if someone had just dragged him away in a hurry. On the floor, his notebook lay torn apart, its pages fluttering in the air. Sarah clenched her jaw, her gaze dropping to the base of the chair. An old wool hat lay on the ground. Arthur never left without wearing it. Connor lowered his head, sniffing the hat, then suddenly let out a deep, furious growl. He turned to Sarah, his eyes conveying a painful truth. Arthur had been kidnapped. Hourglass not done. Who took Arthur? And why? Sarah tightened her fists, trying to stay calm. The Invisibles didn't need an old cemetery keeper. So why had they taken him? She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a wall where Arthur usually pinned his notes. There was an old map of the cemetery, with abandoned underground tunnels marked in red. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Whoever had taken Arthur hadn't killed him immediately. They needed him for something. Connor barked once, urging her forward. "I know, Connor. We have to find him before it's too late." Sarah took a deep breath, preparing for a chase. She wasn't sure she could win. But no matter what happened, she knew Connor would never give up. Nightfall descended upon Hillgrove Cemetery, filling the air with an invisible sense of unease. Sarah stood silently in the small chapel, gripping Arthur's old woolen hat tightly. Was he still alive? Anxiety clenched her chest. Who would kidnap an old cemetery caretaker? And why? Connor stood beside her, his eyes fixed on Arthur's old map, where abandoned tunnels had been marked in red. He sensed something. "Connor, did you find something?" Connor let out a low growl before suddenly leaping up, snapping fiercely at a spot on the wall where the map was hanging. Sarah narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. She pulled the map down, and behind it, collision a small iron door, hidden behind layers of old wooden planks. Her heart skipped a beat. They dragged Arthur into the tunnels beneath the cemetery. Sarah didn't hesitate for another second. She unlocked her gun, unlatched the door, and pulled hard. The door let out a long, piercing creak, revealing a spiral staircase plunging into darkness. Connor didn't wait. He dashed down first. Sarah took a deep breath and followed. The chase had begun. Fire underground, the first clues. The air in the tunnel was damp and suffocating. Sarah could smell the mix of moist earth and something metallic, possibly blood. Connor led the way, his nose working tirelessly. He sniffed, quickening his pace. He knew Arthur had been here, and he couldn't let him disappear forever. They moved through a long corridor with old stone walls. In a dark corner, Sarah suddenly stopped. Something gleamed on the ground. An old watch. She picked it up, her eyes widening in recognition. Arthur's pocket watch, the one he always carried. He tried to leave a trail. Sarah turned to Connor. "Let's go. We're getting close." Hourglass not done, confronting the kidnapper. Footsteps echoed down the endless tunnel. Connor suddenly halted, growling in warning. Sarah squinted, tightening her grip on the gun. Ahead, dim light flickered from an underground room at the end of the tunnel. Voices murmured, "This useless old man knows too much. I'll take care of it. He's of no value anymore." Sarah clenched the trigger. She recognized that voice. Collision Jake Wilkins, a former police officer, the traitor who had betrayed Connor. He was here, and he was about to kill Arthur. Sarah couldn't let that happen. Fire a last-second rescue. Without waiting, Sarah lunged forward. Collision, bam! Collision. She kicked the door open, gun aimed straight at the small room. Inside, Arthur was tied tightly to an old wooden chair, his face bruised, but his eyes still resolute. In front of him, Jake Wilkins held a gleaming knife, his gaze turning icy as he saw Sarah. "Oh!" Faster than I expected. He wasn't surprised. Connor growled and lunged immediately. But Jake was ready. Collision. He fired a shot, the bullet grazing Connor, making him stagger. Sarah retaliated instantly. Collision. Her bullet struck Jake's hand, making him drop the knife. "You betrayed all of us, Jake," Sarah said, her voice cold. Jake smirked, even as his hand bled. "I didn't betray anyone, Sarah. I just chose the winning side." Despite his wound, Connor lunged again, knocking Jake to the ground. His fangs hovered just above Jake's throat, growling menacingly. Jake froze for the first time in his life. He felt real fear. Sarah said nothing more. She kicked his gun away and handcuffed him. "Your game is over. Fire, the mystery isn't over." Sarah rushed to Arthur, cutting his restraints. Arthur exhaled deeply, his wrinkled face softening into a faint smile. "I knew you'd find me, Connor." Connor nuzzled into Arthur, relieved. But as Sarah scanned the room, she noticed something far more alarming. On the table lay a map of the city, marked with multiple red dots. They weren't just targeting Michael Calloway. They have many more targets. She picked up the map, her eyes darkening. This battle wasn't over yet. The map sprawled across the table, red dots scattered throughout the city. Sarah ran her fingers along the markings, her sharp eyes scanning each location. Connor sat beside her, his nose still red from the scrape caused by Jake's shot. Despite that, he remained alert, his gaze fixed on the dark hallway of the tunnel. Arthur, though still weary from the rescue, propped himself up on the table for a clearer view. What are they planning with these points? Sarah gritted her teeth. These aren't just random locations. These red dots, they're all critical data centers and network hubs of the city. They're about to bring down the entire financial system. Fire, the attack has begun. At that moment, Sarah's phone vibrated violently. "Mobile phone, Sarah, pick up." It was Michael Calloway. His voice was trembling but urgent. "Sarah, the banking system is under attack. I just got a warning from my father. The servers are being remotely controlled. They could collapse the entire economy in less than an hour." Sarah bit her lip. Can we stop them? Michael panted. There's a way, but I need to get to the main server center to disable their software. Sarah gripped the gun at her side. Then we're getting you there. She looked at Arthur, then at Connor. It won't be easy. They've surely anticipated this. Arthur nodded, but they didn't anticipate that we have Connor. Connor looked up, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. He knew his mission: protect Michael, stop the catastrophe, and fight until the very last breath. Hourglass not done, facing the mastermind. They didn't take long to reach the city's data center, a towering building with tight security. But when they arrived, everything had changed. Collision, the security system was disabled. The lights were out. The doors were open. Sarah stopped, raising her gun. They're waiting for us. Inside, a tall figure stood amid the flickering server screens. He turned around slowly, his gaze sharp and cold. So, you arrived sooner than I expected. Victor Lenli, the puppet master behind it all. Sarah stepped forward, her voice tense. You're the one behind this. Victor Schmierked. Of course, but you're too late. He raised his hand, pointing at the massive screen. 3 o'clock, 29 minutes and 47 seconds. The countdown timer. In less than 30 minutes, the entire financial system would be erased. Victor Chernkold. Once this system collapses, money will be irrelevant. I will control the entire economy. The question is, can you stop me? Fire. The battle erupts. Before Victor could say another word, Sarah fired first. Collision. But Victor had predicted it. He swiftly dodged to the side, drawing his own gun. Connor lunged straight at him, ready to strike. Collision. A bullet whizzed past, grazing Sarah's shoulder. She staggered but quickly regained her stance, aiming her gun at Victor. Connor leaped, his sharp fangs sinking into Victor's arm, making him roar in pain. You think you can escape? Sarah gritted her teeth. Victor kicked Connor hard, sending him flying. But Connor didn't back down. He immediately got up, growling, his eyes blazing. Nothing could stop him from protecting the ones he cared about. Hourglass not done. Michael and Arthur stopped the attack. While the battle raged on, Michael and Arthur rushed to the central system. I need to hack into this. We only have minutes left. Arthur covered him while Michael rapidly typed commands, trying to disable Victor's software. Laptop computer data recovery in progress. 57%. But then, a red warning flashed on the screen. This can't be. Victor planted a self-destruct program. Arthur clenched his fists. Can you override it? Michael bit his lip, his fingers flying over the keyboard at lightning speed. Laptop computer data recovery. 75%. Just a few more minutes. Fire. The final showdown. Sarah was still exchanging fire with Victor, both injured but refusing to back down. Connor, despite his pain, jumped at Victor again. His fangs sank deep into Victor's leg, making him scream and collapse to the floor. At that moment, collision. Sarah fired the final shot, the bullet piercing Victor's shoulder, bringing him down completely. It's over, Victor. Victor gasped for breath, but smirked. No, the system will still collapse. But he was wrong. Laptop computer data recovery. 100%. Michael had done it. The game is over. Fire, aftermath, and rebirth. Victor was arrested. The Invisibles fell. Arthur was saved. Michael became a hero. Connor, though wounded, remained standing, his tail wagging slightly as Arthur patted his head. Sarah looked down at her loyal friend, smiling. Good job, buddy. The first dawn after the nightmare. The first dawn after the nightmare finally arrived. Sunlight streamed through the towering buildings, casting a glow over the road leading to Hillgrove Cemetery, the place where it all began and where it all ended. Sarah sat on the steps of the old chapel, gazing into the distance. Her entire body felt exhausted, but for the first time in days, she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Connor lay beside her, bandages wrapped around his wounded shoulder. Though in pain, he remained alert, his eyes fixed on the gravestones like a soldier keeping watch after the battle. We did it, Connor. He merely nudged his head against her leg, as if to say that things weren't truly over yet. The remnants of a storm fire. In the distance, police cars still lined the street. Victor Langley had been captured, but the system he created had left scars. The city's data had been restored, yet the damage caused by the Invisibles remained. Michael Calloway was safe, but he knew his family would never be the same again. Nearby, Arthur sipped hot tea from an old porcelain cup. He looked at Sarah, then at Connor, and smiled softly. "This dog saved my life. I think he deserves to be called a hero." Sarah chuckled lightly. "He doesn't need that title, Arthur. He just did the right thing." Arthur nodded. "Sometimes doing the right thing is already a miracle, my dear." Sarah nodded in silent agreement. She had seen it, witnessed it with her own eyes. A dog who had been betrayed, abandoned, yet still chose to save those who turned their backs on him. Connor was no ordinary dog. He was a beacon of hope in the darkness. Connor's choice hourglass not done. After everything was over, Sarah received an offer. Connor lost his old family, but he could start anew. That was what the police chief said when he offered Sarah the chance to adopt Connor and bring him back to the K-9 unit. A dog like this shouldn't waste his life in an old cemetery. Sarah turned to Connor. "What do you want, buddy?" Connor looked at her for a long moment before slowly turning his head toward the cemetery, where Arthur stood, gently running his hand over an old gravestone. He's already chosen this place as his home. Sarah smiled softly. She knew Connor didn't need a glamorous life or a title in the police force. He just needed a place to protect, and that place was Hillgrove. Arthur sat down beside Connor, gently stroking his head. "So, you're staying here with this old man, huh?" Connor merely nuzzled his head against Arthur's knee. "I don't think I could ask for a better friend." A hero without a title fire. Weeks passed, and life gradually returned to normal. Michael continued helping his father rebuild the financial security system, ensuring no hacker group could manipulate it again. Sarah returned to the police force, though she knew she had changed. Arthur carried on as the cemetery caretaker, but now he was no longer alone. Connor became a part of Hillgrove. Every morning, he patrolled the gravestones, not to hunt down criminals, but to protect the memories. A hero doesn't need medals, doesn't need a title, doesn't need praise. They only need a place to belong, and Connor had found his. Epilogue: The Legend of Hillgrove's Guardian Fire. They say that if you pass by Hillgrove Cemetery on a rainy night, you might hear the footsteps of a special guardian. If you look closely, you may spot a pair of amber eyes silently watching you among the gravestones. Not with menace, but with protection. And if you do the right thing, who knows, you might just earn a silent companion, loyal for a lifetime. The sun had risen high, casting its warm rays over Hillgrove Cemetery. Under the shade of an ancient tree, Arthur sat on his familiar wooden bench, holding an old book in his hands. Yet his gaze was fixed on Connor, the dog who was silently patrolling among the gravestones, his eyes watchful like a soldier who had never rested. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Arthur, I've received an offer." Arthur raised an eyebrow, looking at her with curiosity. "The captain wants to bring Connor back to the K-9 unit," Sarah continued, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "He's a special dog. Not many can detect danger and save lives like Connor." Arthur remained silent for a few seconds. He looked at Connor, then sighed. "This boy has been through too much already. Do we humans still want to push him into another battle?" Sarah bit her lip. She understood what Arthur meant. Connor was not just a service dog. He was a soul that had endured pain. Yet he was still willing to fight for what was right. Connor looked up at the two, his ears perked up. It was as if he understood the conversation. Fire the three paths before Connor. Sarah knelt down, gently stroking Connor's head, gazing into his intelligent eyes. "So, what do you want, kid?" If Connor could speak, what would he choose? Stay at Hillgrove Cemetery with Arthur, living peaceful days, guarding this place like a silent protector. Return to the K-9 unit, continuing to serve in dangerous missions, assisting the police in upholding justice. Find a new family, live an ordinary life, forget the painful past, and start over like a normal dog. No one could make the choice for him. Connor glanced at the sky, then back at Sarah, Arthur, and finally at the cemetery gate, the place where everything began. Where would he go next? Connor's story is not just about a dog. It is a story of loyalty, betrayal, and the choice between duty and freedom. We can see Connor's reflection in many people in today's society. Those who have been betrayed, yet still choose to believe in goodness. Those who have endured pain, but refuse to let the past define their future. Those who must face the difficult choice between responsibility and personal happiness. Connor could be any one of us. So if it were you, which path would you choose for Connor? Speech Balloon, share your thoughts. Should Connor stay at Hillgrove, return as a service dog, or find a new family? Let this story continue in each of our minds.